this is going to be figure 1612, a much better version that's underneath my messy version. So we should probably get rid of my messy version. So in this particular case, your book has chosen to instead use a nail. And for some reason, I don't know why, a hot stove is scarier to me. So, but you have some sort of painful, nasty stimulus you want to get away from. The sensory neuron carries the information to the posterior horn where you've got an inner neuron. And that sensory neuron passes along the information of the stimulus. The inner neuron then, its version of processing is to immediately tell the motor neuron sitting in the anterior horn, and then the motor neuron's information is carried to the muscle. And the effector is what they call it, responds. Effectors are like muscles or glands that effect an action. One other thing to notice, what's going on there. So this particular neuron has an extra branch, an extra axon, and from chapter 14, hopefully you remember, if you've got a branch off the side, it's called an axon collateral. So that's an axon collateral off of that axon of the interneuron. This axon collateral is going to go up. Notice also it crosses from left to right because you remember whatever's happening on your left side, you process it in the right side of your brain. And this is where that information will cross. It's right here at the spinal cord, crosses over and then heads up the other side, and it's going up to the brain. Here they have it written. Nerve impulses relayed to the brain. So that information goes up, and that's how you become consciously aware that you've put your hand on a hot stove. But actually, this takes longer to go up to your brain and have your brain process it than this entire arc. So you're already pulling away before you're conscious that it's occurred. Okay. Oh, that's another nice mess over a figure. So this figure in your book shows you two types of reflexes. I will only ask you to know this one. It's called a withdrawal reflex. So you have 3 neurons in a row: sensory, interneuron, motor neuron. And your book also shows you a different type that I'm going to talk about just briefly that isn't response to something noxious, something nasty, but it's in response to some stretching of your muscles. Now on this side, your book has repeated the withdrawal reflex that we did in the previous slide, and they've just done it on the other side of the body. So we've got our 3 neurons, sensory receptor, this time it is burning, and then the sensory neuron carries the information to the interneuron carries it to the motor neuron, and the motor neuron carries the information to the muscle, so it pulls away. They call this a polysynaptic reflex. So poly means many, and in this case it's just 2, but it's more than one, so many. Synapses are, when this neuron talks to this neuron and this neuron talks to this neuron. So this has more than one synapse. The other example they provide over here is a mono. Mono means one. Only one synapse in this particular reflex. So this is the reflex when you go to the doctor and they take that little mallet and they hit your patellar tendon actually, and you respond by contracting your quadricep muscles. So what's going on there is there's a stretch receptor that can detect really rapid stretch. When you hit someone's patellar tendon, it does cause a rapid stretching of the quadriceps muscle, and there's a little receptor in there that detects that. And that receptor is attached to a sensory neuron, and it goes through just like the other sensory neurons, cell body in the posterior root ganglion, and then it actually goes straight to the motor neuron. There's no interneuron. The sensory neuron directly synapses right there. I'm going to do it in red so we can see it even better. That is our one synapse. So that's why it's a monosynaptic. And then that motor neuron sends information right back to the quadriceps and tells it to contract. And then, of course, you extend at the knee joint. You kick your leg out. So this single monosynaptic is actually much it's faster. I don't know if I want to say much, but it's definitely faster because synapses take time. So from chapter 14, I hope you remember that there's an electrical impulse that goes along the axon, and that electrical impulse is called an action potential. That's the electrical part of your nervous system. Now, when you get to the end here, and you have those telodendria, and then at the end of those, you have synaptic knobs. And so we can go back actually to Unit 2 and talk about, from the synaptic knob, you'd release a neurotransmitter. It floats across the synaptic cleft, the space, until it lands on dendritic spines in the next neuron. Well, that whole process of releasing neurotransmitter, floating across the cleft, landing on a receptor in the dendritic spine, that takes time, and it's slower. That whole process at the synapse is much slower than the action potential. So the fewer synapses you have, the faster. So this polysynaptic reflex, when you pull away from something painful, it actually has 2 synapses. It takes longer than 1 synapse, which is interesting because you'd think you'd process pain faster or process a reflex reaction to pain, but you don't. Why the stretch? Because it doesn't hurt unless, maybe they hit your knee too hard there. But this, stretching and contracting isn't painful in and of itself. The reason your body does this is it could get painful if you overstretch. So when you start to stretch the muscle rapidly, your body will react by contracting to protect itself. So remember, we had muscle filaments that, I'll just draw a couple. Again, I don't expect you to know the monosynaptic, but I think it's interesting. So, you have your myofilaments, and they slide past each other. If you really rapidly pull these blue ones away from the red, your body panics because if you pull too far, imagine pulling those red and those blue very far apart, beyond repair. You could do damage to your muscle. You've heard of people overstretching muscles and doing damage. It's definitely possible. And if you start to stretch rapidly, your body does kind of panic and say, well, we don't want to rip the muscle apart entirely. So the response to contract the muscles does the opposite of pulling them apart. Of course, it's going to bring those filaments closer together. So that's why you have that reflex in your patellar tendon. And actually, you have it in all your muscles. It's just this one, because the quadriceps are so big, they produce such a big effect that it's the one you notice. Those of you who work in healthcare may have already learned how to test reflexes, but there are other places in the body you can detect them. And if you've been, doing it for a while as a clinician, you get better at detecting them. They're much more mild and subtle because the muscle's not as big and as strong as the quadriceps. Okay, I want to talk about spinal cord injury really quick because it's interesting, and there is going to be a little reminder of something you will need to know for the exam. At some point, maybe I'll be able to get rid of my scrawl. Okay, spinal cord injury. When you injure your spinal cord, initially, let's say you're in a car accident, you have spinal shock, and there's really no sensation or motor control beneath the spinal cord injury. So let's just say, make it up, this is going to be a spinal cord injury at T6, so the 6th thoracic spinal cord level. So everything below T6, no sensation detected, no motor control. And actually, it often is a little bit higher as well. You just have the shock that spreads maybe up higher to, T4 or something. Then over time, this part that has been damaged and inflamed and swollen, it will heal, and usually then it will settle on whatever spinal cord level that you've injured, the loss of sensation and the loss of motor control. So yeah, long term, you're going to have loss of motor and sensory below the injury. But here's what's interesting. You will retain reflexes. Oh, I crossed it out. Let's do this. Let's do it. Red. This is the interesting thing. You retain reflexes below. So below T6, at T8, you're still going to have reflexes. It only goes to abdominal muscles, so it's probably not that interesting, but you think even lower. In the lumbar and in the sacral regions, those are where you have spinal nerves going to your lower limbs. That means you could still do the stretch reflex when you tap the patellar tendon. That's all they can do is respond to a stretch of the quadriceps. It's the only time they're going to contract it. It's not voluntary, really. It's a reflex. It's processed by the spinal cord, so you don't need the brain. You don't need information from the brain to do it. Hold on, let me erase that. It's a little bit more representative there. So, you have sensory receptor in your quadriceps tendon, takes the information, the sensory neuron, and it synapses in this same level with a motor neuron that goes back and tells the muscle to contract. Now, voluntary information coming from your brain that you consciously want to get down to that, it's not going to make it past the spinal cord injury. This has been blocked. You're not going to get down there. So, interestingly, spinal cord injury, you retain reflexes. One other thing that I want you to know, this is really the reminder that I want you to know, is what is the significance of C3, 4, and 5? Well, they're cervical levels. So if we did have an injury at T6, that's below, you'd still have spinal nerves coming out of C3, 4, and 5, and you'd have connection to the brain, you'd have conscious control. So what is the significance of these particular levels that have not been damaged, that you still have voluntary control? That is where the phrenic nerve comes from. And the phrenic nerve controls the diaphragm. So that means even if, oops, there should be an A in there, sorry. Even if you've got an injury that's very close to the diaphragm, in fact, this is a little bit above the diaphragm, a little bit superior to it, even though you've got a spinal cord injury superior to the diaphragm, because that nerve comes off so high in the neck and descends all the way down to the diaphragm, even though, spinal cord injury is high enough, higher than the diaphragm, you still have control of the diaphragm, because oddly enough, the phrenic nerve comes off up high. So C3, 4, and 5 keeps the diaphragm alive. Thank you guys. Bye.